At dawn on the 25th of October, 1415, the fields of northern France were heavy with mist. The rain of previous days had left the ground soaked and uneven, turning the earth into a mire that clung to every step. In that narrow stretch of land, hemmed in by woodland on both sides, two armies faced one another. On the English side stood men who had marched for weeks, weakened by hunger and disease. Their clothes were worn, their faces pale, their spirits tested. Many had survived the siege of Harfleur, only to find themselves once again in danger, their king insisting that they press forward toward Calais. Fewer than 10,000 remained fit to fight. Across from them stood an army at least 3 times their size. The assembled nobility of France, proud knights and men-at-arms, confident in their numbers, ready to crush the invaders who dared tread their soil. The battle that was about to unfold would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary in the history of medieval Europe. Agincourt was not merely a clash of weapons, but a collision of two visions of war. On one side, the traditional power of chivalry, heavily armed nobles who believed that valor, bloodline, and strength of arms could not fail. On the other side, an army made up largely of common archers, men whose weapon was not the sword or the lance but the longbow, a tool of wood and string, wielded with deadly precision. At the heart of the English force stood a young monarch, Henry V, who had only recently ascended to the throne, but who already carried the weight of his kingdom's future on his shoulders. This battle did not appear inevitable. England had entered the 100 Years' War generations earlier, and for a time its victories had seemed unstoppable. Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 had proven the effectiveness of English tactics and the devastating power of the longbow. Yet by the early 15th century, fortunes had shifted. England was weakened by internal unrest, its finances stretched thin. France, despite the illness of its king, Charles VI, remained vast and resourceful. The French nobility, though divided by rivalries, could still raise armies that dwarfed anything the English could field. For Henry, a young king seeking to secure his crown and his legitimacy, the campaign of 1415 was a chance to reclaim past glory and to assert a claim to the French throne. His army had crossed the Channel in August, besieging the port of Harfleur. Victory came slowly and at great cost. Disease spread through the camp, cutting down thousands of men. By the time the town surrendered, Henry's force was already diminished. He decided not to risk further sieges, but instead marched his men north toward Calais, where ships could return them home. It was meant to be a show of endurance, a demonstration that, even weakened, the English could march across French territory unchallenged. But the French nobility would not allow such an escape. Word spread quickly, and lords from across the kingdom mustered to intercept him. By late October, Henry's path was blocked. Near the small village of Agincourt, the English found themselves trapped. The French army, numbering perhaps 20 to 30,000, stood across the field. Their leaders included dukes, counts, and some of the greatest knights of France. Their confidence was absolute. They believed they would not simply win, but destroy the English force entirely, capturing or killing the king who had dared invade. And so the stage was set for a confrontation that seemed absurdly one-sided. The English were hungry, sick, and exhausted. Their armor was lighter, their numbers smaller, their position precarious. The French possessed overwhelming strength, but also the pride of nobles who expected victory as their right. Between them lay a field of mud, narrow and confining, that would soon shape the outcome in ways no one could have predicted. Agincourt would become more than a battle. It would become a symbol of how discipline, ingenuity, and circumstance could overturn expectation. It would show how the longbow, wielded by common men, could alter the fate of kingdoms. It would reveal Henry V not simply as a monarch, but as a leader who inspired loyalty, steadied courage, and guided his soldiers through despair to triumph. For France, it would be remembered as a day of tragedy when valor and tradition were swallowed by mud and broken under relentless arrows. The fascination of Agincourt lies in the contradiction it embodies. How could so small and weary an army defeat so great and confident a host? Was it Henry's leadership, the terrain, the technology of the bow, or the disunity of France that decided the outcome? Each explanation holds part of the truth, yet none can fully capture the shock of that day. Chroniclers at the time wrote with awe, unable to reconcile what they had seen. Later generations would turn to poetry and drama to make sense of it, Shakespeare most famously giving Henry words of defiance and fellowship that have echoed ever since. But before the legend, there was the reality. Men standing in mud, waiting for the charge, unsure if they would live to see another dawn. The Battle of Agincourt was not born in isolation. It was the result of decades of conflict, of royal claims and dynastic rivalries, of a war that stretched across more than 100 years. To understand how that day unfolded, one must trace the path that led England and France to this moment. The quarrels of kings, the divisions within nations, the march that brought a weary army into the jaws of peril. Only then can the miracle of Agincourt be fully grasped, the day when the impossible became real and a kingdom's fate was reshaped in the mud of northern France. Yet the drama of that misty morning in October 1415 could not be understood in isolation. The clash at Agincourt was not a sudden spark, but the product of generations of rivalry, ambition, and unfinished wars. The weary men who stood ankle-deep in mud carried on their shoulders the weight of nearly 80 years of struggle between England and France. To grasp why Henry V marched into such peril and why the French nobility assembled with such determination to stop him, one must step back into the long and turbulent shadow of the 100 Years' War, a conflict born not merely of pride, but of questions of inheritance, legitimacy, and the destiny of two kingdoms. The story of Agincourt cannot be understood without stepping back into the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. This vast conflict, stretching from 1337 to 1453, was not a single continuous struggle, but a series of campaigns, truces, and uneasy lulls, each shaped by dynastic claims, national rivalries, and the ambitions of kings. At its heart lay a question that seemed simple, but carried the weight of kingdoms. Who had the right to rule France? The origins of the war were deeply rooted in the tangled dynastic ties of Europe's royal houses. The English kings of the Plantagenet dynasty had long held lands in France, remnants of the sprawling Angevin Empire, once ruled by Henry II and his sons. These territories, Gascony in the southwest, and others before it, were technically held as fiefs under the French crown. Yet the kings of England did not view themselves as mere vassals. They considered themselves rulers in their own right, and the tension between lord and vassal simmered for generations. The spark that ignited open conflict came in 1328, when the French king Charles IV died without a male heir. The question of succession divided the realm. According to strict French custom, the crown could not pass through the female line. That meant Isabella, Charles' sister, could not inherit. Yet Isabella was also the mother of Edward III of England, who promptly asserted that through her he had a rightful claim to the French throne. The French nobility rejected this argument, invoking the principle of Salic law, a code that excluded inheritance through women, and instead crowned Philip VI of the Valois line. For Edward III, this was not only an insult, but a direct threat to English interests. The Valois kings sought to tighten their grip on lands still under English control, particularly the Duchy of Aquitaine. Edward's claim to the French crown became both a political tool and a banner under which he could rally support at home. Thus began a conflict that would stretch beyond his lifetime and shape the destinies of both nations. The early decades of the war brought dramatic English victories. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, Edward III's forces, including his son, the Black Prince, humiliated the French chivalry. The longbow proved its worth, cutting down wave after wave of armored knights who charged recklessly across the field. 10 years later, in 1356, the English triumphed again at Poitiers, where the Black Prince captured King John II of France himself. These victories gave England a position of extraordinary strength. Through the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, Edward renounced his claim to the French crown in exchange for enlarged territorial holdings and relative independence for his French lands. For a time, it seemed as though the balance of power might shift decisively toward England, but the tide of war is rarely constant. The later 14th century saw a French revival. Under King Charles V, known as the Wise, France avoided the rash battles that had cost them dearly in earlier years. Instead, through careful strategy and the leadership of skilled commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, the French gradually reclaimed much of their lost territory. English fortunes waned, and domestic troubles weakened their resolve. The death of Edward III, the short reign of Richard II, and political strife at home eroded the momentum once gained on foreign fields. By the dawn of the 15th century, the balance appeared to favor France. Though still divided by factional disputes, France had regained much of its strength. England, in contrast, was weary. Its kings had been forced to navigate rebellion and financial strain. The glories of Crécy and Poitiers seemed distant memories. For many, the 100 Years' War had become a drawn-out struggle with little hope of resolution. Yet history often turns on the ambitions of individuals. In 1413, Henry V ascended the English throne. He inherited not only a troubled kingdom, but also the lingering legacy of his ancestors' claims. For Henry, the war in France was not a burden to escape, but an opportunity to seize. His kingdom needed unity, his crown needed legitimacy, and the cause of war promised both. To the people of England, victories abroad could heal divisions at home. To Henry himself, the claim to France was not a fading dream, but a living right. And so, on the eve of Agincourt, the stage had been set by nearly 80 years of conflict. The war had begun as a quarrel over inheritance, expanded into a struggle for territory and survival, and by 1415 had become the arena in which Henry V would prove himself. The legacy of Crécy and Poitiers hung in the air, reminders of what had once been possible. The French revival was real, but their kingdom remained fractured. Against this backdrop, Henry launched his campaign, believing that fortune could be made to turn once more. The weight of nearly 80 years of war hung over both realms, shaping the world into which Henry V stepped. The quarrels of inheritance, the triumphs of Crécy and Poitiers, the French revival under Charles V, all of these were the stage on which the young king would act. To understand Agincourt, it is not enough to trace the rivalry between England and France. One must also look to the figure who carried his kingdom into that fateful campaign. In 1413, when Henry of Monmouth ascended the throne, he inherited not only the long shadow of the 100 Years' War, but also a kingdom divided, uncertain, and in need of renewal. When Henry of Monmouth ascended the English throne in March 1413, he inherited not a stable realm, but a kingdom scarred by turbulence. His father, Henry IV, had seized the crown in 1399 by deposing Richard II, a daring act that left behind questions of legitimacy and years of unrest. Rebellion in Wales under Owain Glyndwr, noble uprisings, and constant challenges to authority had marked the reign of the first Lancastrian king. By the time Henry V assumed power, England was weary of division and uncertainty. The young monarch knew that to secure his dynasty's future, he would need to bind his people together under a renewed sense of order, discipline, and common purpose. Henry V was only 26 when he became king, yet his youth concealed a man hardened by war and politics. As a teenager, he had fought at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where he was wounded but proved his courage. As Prince of Wales, he had commanded forces against the Welsh rebels and faced the difficult tasks of governance. The years of his father's reign had given him first-hand experience of both military struggle and political fragility. When he took the crown, he did so with a determination not simply to rule, but to redefine kingship in England. At home, Henry set about strengthening royal authority. He reconciled with former opponents of the Lancastrian regime, offering pardons and positions to those who would serve the crown loyally. Where his father had been mistrustful and often embattled, Henry sought unity, presenting himself as a just ruler who could rise above faction. He devoted attention to the church, reaffirming Orthodox faith and aligning himself with ecclesiastical leaders. Mindful that spiritual legitimacy could reinforce political power, he acted firmly against dissenters such as the Lollards, whose calls for religious reform threatened both crown and church. By projecting an image of discipline and moral authority, Henry restored confidence in the monarchy at home. Yet domestic stability, though essential, was not enough. A king who had inherited his crown through a contested line could never entirely silence whispers of doubt. Henry understood that legitimacy could be most powerfully cemented through success abroad. Victory in war had long been the surest way to unify a realm, silence rivals, and elevate a monarch's standing. For Henry, the natural stage for such a display was France. The claim to the French throne, advanced by his great-grandfather, Edward III, remained alive, if dormant. To pursue it anew was not only to press a dynastic right, but also to revive the memory of English triumphs past, to bind the present to the legacy of Crécy and Poitiers. This ambition was not reckless. Henry was deliberate in his preparation. He secured peace with Scotland to reduce the threat of war on two fronts. He sought alliances with Burgundy, exploiting the divisions within France. He reorganized his finances, tightened royalist administration, and ensured that his army would be well supplied and disciplined. All of these measures spoke to his vision. He was not a king content with inherited disorder, but one who sought to forge a new path through calculated strength. When Henry turned his gaze across the Channel, it was with more than conquest in mind. France was not only a rival, it was the key to his own image as king. By winning in France, he would prove that the Lancastrian dynasty was not a usurping line clinging to power, but a rightful house chosen by destiny. Victory abroad would erase doubts at home. Failure, however, would imperil everything. In 1415, after 2 years of consolidation, Henry launched his campaign. It was framed not as an opportunistic raid, but as the rightful pursuit of inheritance. He demanded recognition of his claim, knowing the French would refuse. By rejecting his terms, they gave him the pretext he required. The expedition was no small gamble. The risks were immense, but Henry's resolve was unshaken. He believed that war could achieve what politics alone could not, the transformation of a disputed crown into one beyond challenge. Thus, on the eve of Agincourt, Henry V was more than a warrior king. He was the embodiment of ambition sharpened by necessity, of a dynasty striving to prove itself. His reign had begun with the challenge of healing a divided kingdom. His answer was to seek glory not only within England's borders, but beyond them, on the fields of France, where the fate of nations and his own legacy would be decided. While Henry V was binding England together with discipline and purpose, across the Channel, the scene could not have been more different. France, vast and powerful in appearance, was weighed down by internal strife. Where England had found unity under a single will, France was torn between factions, its crown weakened by a king whose illness left the realm vulnerable. To understand the imbalance that shaped Agincourt, one must look at the fractured kingdom that awaited Henry's challenge. While Henry V prepared his kingdom for war, France was gripped by divisions that threatened its very stability. To an outside observer, it remained the mightiest realm in Western Europe, vast in territory, rich in population, and home to some of the most powerful noble families of the age. Yet beneath this surface lay fractures that weakened the kingdom at its core. On the eve of Agincourt, France was a giant weighed down by discord. The greatest wound came not from foreign armies, but from within. For decades, French politics had been dominated by the bitter rivalry between two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. The conflict began as a struggle for influence at the royal court, but it quickly spread across the kingdom, shaping alliances, loyalties, and enmities in every province. The Armagnacs centered around the powerful Count of Armagnac and allied with the Duke of Orleans, claimed to defend the interests of the crown. Opposing them stood the Burgundians, led by the Dukes of Burgundy, who commanded enormous wealth and territory, stretching into the Low Countries. Each faction claimed to act in the name of France, but in truth, their rivalry sapped the strength of the nation and left it vulnerable. At the heart of this discord stood King Charles VI. Crowned in 1380, Charles should have been the unifying figure of his generation. Instead, his reign was marked by a tragic personal struggle. From his youth, Charles suffered bouts of mental illness that left him incapable of ruling for long stretches of time. At moments, he believed himself made of glass, terrified that he might shatter. At others, he raged or fell into silence, unable to distinguish friend from foe. During these periods of incapacity, the machinery of the state was left in the hands of regents and factions. Power shifted unpredictably, and the authority of the crown was diluted. The consequences were profound. Without a steady monarch, France was effectively governed by competing nobles who placed their interests above unity. Armagnac and Burgundian forces clashed not only in the council chambers of Paris, but on the fields of the countryside, dragging towns and villages into their feud. Each side sought alliances abroad. The Burgundians often leaned toward cooperation with England, while the Armagnacs framed themselves as defenders against foreign influence. Civil conflict drained resources, eroded trust, and left the kingdom perilously exposed to outside attack. This fragmentation was more than political, it was psychological. The French nobility still saw themselves as heirs to the tradition of chivalry, confident in their numbers and their prestige. Yet they were entering the second decade of the 15th century burdened by memory. The defeats at Crécy and Poitiers still haunted them, reminders of how rash charges and divided leadership had ended in disaster. At the same time, the disunity of factions made it nearly impossible to develop coherent strategy. Where unity was needed, there was suspicion. Where decisive action was demanded, there was hesitation. Thus, when Henry V launched his campaign in 1415, France was not prepared to meet it with the full strength of a united realm. Theoretically, the French could summon armies many times the size of Henry's force. In practice, coordination was poor, and rival lords often distrusted one another more than they feared the invader. The king himself could not provide direction, his illness left the court in confusion, and regents struggled for dominance. And yet, for all its weakness, France remained formidable. The nobility were proud, their resources vast, and their confidence deep. They believed that numbers alone would suffice, that once the English army was cornered, its destruction was inevitable. It was this mixture of power and fragility, of immense potential undermined by internal strife, that defined France on the eve of Agincourt. The contrast between the two kingdoms could not have been sharper. In England, a young and determined king had unified his realm, restored order, and prepared with methodical care for war abroad. In France, a great realm staggered beneath the weight of factionalism, its monarch incapacitated, its nobles consumed by rivalry. And yet, because of its sheer size and wealth, France still seemed destined to overwhelm its smaller, hungrier enemy. It was this paradox that framed the encounter of 1415. An England that appeared weak, but was united under one will, faced a France that seemed strong, but was divided against itself. The outcome of Agincourt would prove which mattered more, numbers and pride, or discipline and unity. The contrast could not have been starker, a unified England under a resolute young king facing a fractured France, rich in resources, but weakened by rivalries and an ailing monarch. Yet division alone did not set the armies on a collision course. What transformed this tension into open war was Henry V's choice. Having secured his throne at home, he now turned outward, pressing a claim that diplomacy could not resolve. The failures of negotiation, the lure of legitimacy, and the opportunity presented by France's disunity all converged, driving Henry toward the fateful campaign of 1415. By 1415, the long quarrel between England and France had ripened into a confrontation that could no longer be delayed. Henry V, young yet seasoned, had spent 2 years consolidating his crown at home and now turned his attention outward. For him, war with France was not an act of sudden impulse, but the culmination of diplomacy, ambition, and necessity. The question was not whether England would press its claim, but how and when. Henry's claim to the French throne was rooted in the line of descent from Edward III, whose mother had been the sister of the last Capetian king. The French had long dismissed this claim, invoking the Salic law to exclude inheritance through the female line. Yet to Henry, as to Edward before him, the claim remained valid. It was not a hollow gesture, but a banner under which to unite his people and give purpose to his reign. For a young king eager to prove himself, nothing could serve better than the pursuit of a crown that had eluded his forefathers. At first, Henry did not seek war directly. He approached the French court with proposals of marriage. If he could wed Catherine of Valois, daughter of King Charles VI, it might bind the two kingdoms in alliance and give legitimacy to his claims. Yet Henry's terms were bold, even uncompromising. He demanded not only Catherine's hand, but also a vast dowry and recognition of English rights in France. To the French, burdened already by factional divisions and resentful of English demands, these terms seemed little more than provocation. Negotiations collapsed. What might have been settled by diplomacy instead deepened the quarrel. The failure of diplomacy left Henry with two options: retreat from his ambitions or stake everything on war. He chose the latter. For Henry, the decision was as much about England as it was about France. At home, doubts about the Lancastrian dynasty lingered. Victory across the Channel could silence those doubts forever. Abroad, France's weakness was evident. The rivalry between Armagnac and Burgundy fractured the kingdom, while the king's illness left its leadership uncertain. Henry saw his moment. By pressing hard, he could exploit division, strike while France was distracted, and compel recognition of his claims. Thus, in the spring of 1415, Henry declared his intention to enforce his rights by arms. Parliament was summoned, and the cause was presented not as reckless aggression, but as the rightful pursuit of inheritance and justice. The clergy lent support, framing the war as a righteous endeavor, while the nobility rallied under the prospect of honor and reward. To Henry, the campaign promised multiple gains. It would strengthen his dynasty, prove his leadership, and perhaps achieve a settlement that would crown him king of both realms. The preparations were immense. Ships were gathered along the southern coast, supplies amassed, contracts signed with captains and men-at-arms. England had seen expeditions before, but this was different in its scale and its clear intent. When Henry's army finally sailed across the Channel in August, it did so with a sense of destiny. The banners of St. George flew not merely for conquest, but for the vindication of a claim and the assertion of a monarch's will. The French, meanwhile, viewed Henry's demands as an affront to their sovereignty. They had endured English invasions before, but this time the invader came not as a raider, but as a claimant to the very crown of France. To yield would be to surrender their kingdom's independence. To resist would be to face once more the deadly archers and disciplined ranks of an English army. In this clash of claims, pride, and necessity, the path to Agincourt was set. Henry's pursuit of a crown by marriage had failed, and in its failure he found his justification for war. The campaign of 1415 was not simply about territory, it was about legitimacy, honor, and survival. For Henry, it was the chance to transform the doubts of his dynasty into glory. For France, it was the challenge of confronting an enemy who demanded not just land, but their crown itself. With diplomacy exhausted and his claims rejected, Henry V had set his course. War was no longer a matter of possibility, but of inevitability. The Parliament had granted him support, the Church had blessed his cause, and the nobility had answered his call. All that remained was to put resolve into action. In the summer of 1415, the preparations of 2 years came to fruition. Ships crowded the southern ports of England, soldiers gathered under their banners, and the Channel became the threshold between ambition and reality. When Henry finally set sail, he carried with him not only an army but the hopes of a dynasty. His first target was clear: the Norman port of Harfleur, the gateway through which the campaign would begin. In August 1415, the long-awaited campaign began. Henry V gathered his army, perhaps 12,000 strong, and sailed from England across the Channel. The fleet, a forest of masts on the horizon, carried not only soldiers but also carpenters, engineers, clerics, and supplies. Their destination was the Norman coast, and their target the port of Harfleur. Situated at the mouth of the Seine, Harfleur was a valuable prize, a fortified harbor that could serve as a gateway into the French interior and a foothold for English power. The landing was successful. English troops poured ashore, banners raised, weapons at the ready. Almost immediately, Henry ordered the city surrounded. Harfleur was no minor village, but a stronghold with thick walls, towers, and a determined garrison. If Henry was to march deeper into France, he needed this port secured. Without it, his supply lines would be vulnerable and retreat by sea uncertain. Thus began the siege of Harfleur, a contest of endurance as much as of arms. Henry's army set to work with relentless discipline. Siege engines were assembled, trenches dug, artillery positioned. The English pressed closer, tightening their grip on the city. From within, the defenders resisted fiercely. They launched sallies against the besiegers, repaired damage under cover of night, and held firm in the belief that relief might come from the French nobility. For weeks, thunder of stone-throwing engines and the whir of arrows filled the air. The struggle tested not only courage but stamina. As the days stretched into weeks, the greatest enemy proved not the garrison, but disease. Dysentery spread rapidly through the crowded English camp. Soldiers weakened, their strength drained by illness, while the summer heat and unsanitary conditions worsened the outbreak. Even noblemen were not spared. Henry, ever vigilant, enforced discipline and sought to maintain morale, but he could not stop the toll. Thousands fell sick. Many would never recover. The army that had crossed the Channel with confidence was being thinned before it had fought a single major battle. Still, the siege continued. Henry's resolve was unyielding. He walked among his men, encouraging them, reminding them of the cause for which they endured. The city, meanwhile, began to starve. Supplies dwindled, wells grew foul, and desperation spread among the defenders. The French crown, paralyzed by factional disputes, could not muster an army in time to break the siege. Harfleur was left to fight alone. By mid-September, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Breaches in the walls widened, and the garrison, exhausted and starving, recognized that further resistance would mean annihilation. Negotiations followed, and on the 22nd of September, Harfleur surrendered to Henry, the English. Banners were raised above its walls, and the king had his foothold in Normandy. The prize was his, yet it came at a steep cost. The victory was bittersweet. The siege had drained the army. Disease had cut the numbers severely, reducing the force by nearly a third. Many of the sick had to be sent home. Others lay buried in foreign soil. Even Henry's own brother, the Duke of Clarence, was among those stricken. What remained of the army was tired, hungry, and far less formidable than when it had first landed. Henry now faced a choice. He could consolidate at Harfleur, holding his new conquest until reinforcements arrived, or he could press forward, seeking to prove that his campaign had not stalled after a single siege. True to his character, Henry chose the bolder course. He would march his army north toward Calais, challenging the French to stop him. Thus, the siege of Harfleur, though a victory, became the prelude to a greater trial. The English had secured a port, but at the price of strength. Ahead lay the long, weary march through hostile country, with an army weakened by disease and hunger, and waiting for them, gathering in ever greater numbers, was the host of France. The capture of Harfleur gave Henry a foothold in Normandy, but it was a victory paid for in blood and sickness. His army, once confident and strong, was now thinned and weary. What should have been the foundation of conquest became instead a burden, draining strength before the campaign had truly begun. And so, with a diminished host, Henry faced a fateful choice: to remain and hold his prize, or to march onward. True to his character, he chose movement. The road north to Calais now beckoned, a march through hostile country that would test his army's endurance even more than the siege itself. When Harfleur finally surrendered in September 1415, Henry V stood victorious, yet his triumph was fragile. The city was his, but the price had been staggering. Dysentery had ravaged the army, leaving thousands unfit for service. Many had been sent back across the Channel. Others remained behind as garrisons to secure the captured port. What had begun as an expedition of perhaps 12,000 men was now reduced to a weary corps of 6,000 to 9,000. The army was no longer the confident host that had landed weeks before, but a diminished, sickly band. Henry now faced a decision that would shape the course of his campaign. He could remain in Harfleur, consolidate his position, and wait for reinforcements from England. Such a course would be cautious, yet it risked giving the French time to muster their strength and trap him in Normandy. To march deeper inland carried dangers of its own, but Henry's resolve was not built on caution. He sought not merely to capture a single port, but to prove that his crown could command obedience in the heart of France. And so, he chose the boldest path. He would lead his army on a march northward to Calais, the last English stronghold in France, and from there return home in triumph. It was a decision both audacious and perilous. The march to Calais would take his men through hostile territory, across rivers and valleys, with the French nobility gathering in his shadow. His soldiers were exhausted, their clothing ragged, their supplies thin. Bread was scarce, meat rarer still. Foraging in enemy lands brought little relief, and the French, aware of his movements, stripped the countryside to deny him provisions. Each step forward meant deeper hardship. The army advanced nonetheless, bound together by discipline and the king's presence. Henry rode at their head, stern yet resolute, sharing in the privations of his men. He knew morale was fragile, but he also knew that retreat into passivity would erode confidence. By pressing onward, he kept his soldiers moving toward a tangible goal: Calais, the safe harbor of English power. As the column wound its way across Normandy and Picardy, the sense of danger grew. Scouts reported French forces shadowing their progress, gathering in ever larger numbers. Rumors spread that the French host already outnumbered them 3-1, perhaps more. The soldiers could not ignore the threat, yet the march itself became a test of endurance as much as courage. Rain turned the roads to mud, swollen rivers slowed progress, and hunger gnawed at their strength. Many trudged on with hollow eyes, their boots sinking in the mire, their banners drooping with damp. Yet in hardship lay resilience. The English army was not a rabble, but a force seasoned by discipline. The archers, hardened peasants, and yeomen marched with their long bows slung across their backs, enduring privation with a grim determination. The men-at-arms, fewer in number but clad in armor, kept order in the ranks. Each day they moved forward, mile after weary mile, across a countryside that offered no welcome. Henry himself was tireless. Chroniclers later recorded how he shared the burdens of his men, ate the same meager rations, and refused comforts that would set him apart. His authority did not rest solely on command, but on example. In the endless march toward Calais, his presence was the glue that kept despair from breaking the army apart. By mid-October, the English had crossed the Somme, evading French attempts to block their passage. But the escape was costly in effort, and the army's weakness grew more apparent with each day. Numbers had dwindled further from illness and fatigue. What remained was perhaps 6,000 fighting men, facing the prospect of meeting a French force 3 or 4 times their size. Still, Henry pressed on. His aim was not reckless glory, but survival through resolve. Calais lay ahead, but the shadow of confrontation grew nearer with every step. The French, stung by the loss of Harfleur, had resolved not to let the invader slip away unpunished. As the weary English trudged northward, the trap was closing. The march to Calais was no mere retreat, but the path that would lead inexorably to Agincourt. The march toward Calais had begun as an act of endurance, but each mile carried the English deeper into peril. Exhaustion gnawed at their strength, and yet worse than hunger or mud was the knowledge that their enemy was watching. The French nobility, long humiliated and now stirred to fury, would not allow Henry's army to slip away unchallenged. Even as the English pressed forward, news of their retreat spread across France, summoning lords and knights to arms. What had started as a weary march was turning inexorably into a march toward confrontation. As Henry V's weary army trudged northward toward Calais, the news of his retreat spread quickly across France. To the French nobility, this was not merely an English withdrawal, but an insult. An invader who had seized Harfleur and dared to march across their kingdom could not be allowed to escape unpunished. The honor of France was at stake, and the opportunity to strike seemed at last within their grasp. Messengers rode from town to town, summoning lords to arms. Dukes, counts, and knights answered, eager not only to defend their homeland, but to erase the humiliation of past defeats. The memory of Crécy and Poitiers, still haunting after 70 years, spurred them to prove that French chivalry had not withered. This time, they told themselves, the English would not slip away. This time, overwhelming force would crush the enemy. By October, the host of France had begun to gather. Estimates vary, but contemporary chronicles and later historians speak of a force between 20 and 30,000 strong, men-at-arms, mounted knights, infantry, and crossbowmen. The nobility came in splendor, wearing coats of arms that displayed centuries of lineage. For them, the campaign was not simply a duty, but a matter of pride, a chance to demonstrate valor before their peers, and to avenge the dishonor inflicted by generations of English raids. Yet beneath the banners and bravado lay a lack of unity. The factions of Armagnac and Burgundy still divided the realm, and though both now faced a common foe, mutual suspicion lingered. Command was dispersed among several noble leaders. Still, the sheer weight of numbers seemed decisive. Against Henry's depleted force of perhaps 6,000 men, the French could field 3, even 4 times as many. The imbalance promised an easy victory. As the French army gathered, their determination hardened. They did not intend merely to block Henry's path to Calais. They intended to trap and destroy him. The capture of an English king, or his death in battle, would end the invasion in a single stroke and restore French prestige. The nobles of France dreamed of glory, of ransoms that might enrich them, of fame sung in chronicles. The prospect of crushing an enemy so diminished filled them with confidence. Meanwhile, the English scouts brought word of the growing threat. Reports reached Henry that the French were assembling ahead of him, that every road northward might soon be blocked. His men knew what this meant. The march that had begun as a path of endurance was turning into a march toward battle. Weariness deepened, but so too did resolve. To stop now would be to invite destruction. To press on was the only hope. The French, encouraged by their numbers, made no attempt to harry the English from a distance. They sought a set battle, confident of their advantage. Slowly, deliberately, they positioned themselves to intercept Henry's army, choosing ground where their cavalry and men-at-arms could be deployed in strength. The moment of confrontation drew nearer. By late October, as the English crossed into Picardy, the shadow of the French host loomed large. Chroniclers describe the spectacle of French forces massing, their banners flying, their armor gleaming in the pale autumn light. To the exhausted English, the sight must have been daunting. An army vast, resplendent, and confident, barring their way home. Yet appearances could be deceiving. For all their numbers, the French carried the burden of overconfidence and the complexity of divided leadership. The English, though few, were bound by discipline and the singular will of their king. The collision was inevitable. Both sides knew that the coming clash would decide more than a march or a campaign. It would determine the honor of nations and the course of the war. Thus the scene was set. The English, weary and diminished, pressed on toward their destiny. The French, emboldened and eager, closed the trap. Ahead lay a narrow field near the village of Agincourt, where 2 armies, unequal in size but equal in determination, would soon meet. The long march was ending, and the battle was about to begin. The long march was over. The French had gathered in overwhelming numbers, and the English, worn by hunger and fatigue, could go no farther. At last, both armies stood within sight of one another, divided only by fields soaked with autumn rain. The clash was inevitable, but first came the silence of anticipation. As the sun set on October 24th, the English made camp near the village of Agincourt. The waiting was almost over. The night ahead would test their spirit before the dawn summoned them to battle. On the evening of October 24th, 1415, the English army made camp near the small village of Agincourt. The long march was at an end, and before them lay the certainty of battle. The ground was damp from autumn rains, the air chilled by the season. Tents sagged under the weight of water, fires sputtered in the mud, and soldiers huddled close for warmth. There was no disguising the hardship. The men were exhausted, their clothes worn thin, their food almost gone. Many had not eaten properly in days. Some were weakened by illness, others by the relentless march. Yet beneath the fatigue and hunger, a resolve had taken hold. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew there was no turning back. The size of the French host was no secret. Rumors had spread through the camp all day, 20,000, 30,000, perhaps more. The English were no more than 6,000 or 7,000. The disparity weighed on the soldiers' minds, and yet despair did not dominate. Instead, a grim determination settled over them. The men understood that their survival depended not on numbers, but on resolve, discipline, and the ground on which they would fight. They were trapped, but they were not broken. In the flickering firelight, men spoke in low voices. Some whispered prayers, seeking courage in the promise of heaven. Others sharpened their arrows, tightening bowstrings, repairing worn equipment. The archers, hardened by long years of practice, tended their weapons with care. Each arrow, each bow was a lifeline. The men-at-arms, fewer in number, checked their armor, prepared their lances and swords, and spoke quietly with comrades. There was little laughter, but there was no chaos either. It was the calm of men who had marched too far and suffered too much to give way to fear. Henry V moved among them. The king did not remain apart, cloistered in comfort. Instead, he walked the camp in the dark, speaking to his soldiers, offering words of encouragement. Chroniclers tell of how he reminded them of their cause, of the justice of their claim, of the honor that awaited them if they held firm. He was not a distant sovereign, but a leader sharing in their struggle, binding them together by presence and word. For many, the sight of their king, calm and resolute, was worth more than food or rest. As the night deepened, the stillness was broken only by the sounds of the camp, the crackle of fires, the coughs of the sick, the murmurs of prayer. Some men tried to sleep, wrapping themselves in cloaks damp with dew, knowing that dawn might be their last. Others stared into the flames, lost in thought. They remembered their homes across the sea, families far away, the reasons they marched. For them, the coming battle was not only about crowns and kingdoms, but about survival and honor. Across the fields, the French camp was alive with a different energy. Banners waved, trumpets sounded, voices rang in confidence. The nobles of France prepared with the expectation of triumph. Their numbers gave them assurance. Their pride gave them certainty. But for the English, there was no such luxury. Their confidence had to come from within, from their king, from their comrades, from the knowledge that desperation itself could be turned into strength. Henry, in his own tent, prayed as well. He understood the weight of the coming dawn, his dynasty's legitimacy, his kingdom's unity, his own survival, all rested on what would happen on the muddy fields of Agincourt. Yet he did not waver. He believed that the discipline of his archers, the resolve of his men-at-arms, and the providence of God could carry the day. His faith steadied him, and through him, steadied his army. The night before, Agincourt was not filled with bravado. It was filled with endurance. Each soldier faced the knowledge of overwhelming odds, yet each also carried the quiet determination to stand. The hardships of Harfleur, the agony of the march, the hunger and sickness, they had already endured so much. One more trial lay ahead, and they would meet it together. And so the English army passed the night, hungry but unbroken, weary but resolute. They waited for the dawn, for the trumpet calls that would summon them to the field. In the darkness, under the cold sky of October, they stood on the edge of legend. By morning, the world would know whether their courage could defy the impossible. The night of endurance gave way to a morning of reckoning. As the first light crept over the sodden fields, the soldiers who had prayed, sharpened, and waited now rose to face their destiny. The campfires of the English smoldered into smoke, while across the field the banners of France caught the dawn. Between them lay the ground that would decide everything, a narrow strip of farmland, drenched in rain, hemmed in by forest. It was on this stage, carved by nature and weather, that the Battle of Agincourt would unfold. Dawn broke on October 25th, 1415. As the first light crept across the misty fields of northern France, the two armies prepared for confrontation. The air was cold, the ground sodden from days of rain. What should have been farmland lay transformed into a quagmire, every step sinking into mud. This was the field of Agincourt, a narrow strip of open land hemmed in by dense woodland on either side, a corridor of earth that would funnel thousands of men into deadly proximity. For the French, the battlefield seemed ideal. They had the numbers, perhaps 20,000 or more, and they expected that their armored knights and men-at-arms would simply sweep aside the smaller English host. But the very shape of the land betrayed them. The width of the field was constricted, leaving little room for maneuver. Their advantage in cavalry and numbers could not be deployed to full effect. Instead of a broad plain where horse and knight could ride freely, the French faced a bottleneck of mud and trees. For Henry V, the terrain was a gift. His army, no more than 6,000 or 7,000 men, could stretch across the narrow front without leaving gaps. He positioned his archers along the flanks, their longbows ready, sharpened stakes planted before them to ward off cavalry. At the center stood his men-at-arms, dismounted knights and soldiers, prepared to fight on foot, forming a solid line of defense. The small size of the English host became an advantage. It allowed them to fit neatly across the field, shield to shield, bow to bow, without fear of being outflanked. The ground itself added to their cause. The heavy rains had turned the freshly plowed fields into a mire. Horses would struggle to charge. Men weighed down by armor would stumble. Every step forward for the French would be laborious. While the English, fewer in number and lighter in armor, could hold their ground, the mud was no respecter of nobility or wealth. It would cling to knight and peasant alike, slowing, sapping, exhausting. The English archers, hardened by years of practice, knew their role well. They had faced French knights before, at Crécy and Poitiers, and had seen how the longbow could shatter even the proudest charge. Each archer carried not just a bow, but sheaves of arrows, enough to darken the sky. Their stakes, driven into the earth at an angle, created a bristling barrier that would break the momentum of any horseman. Behind these defenses, the archers waited with patience, confident in their craft. Henry himself surveyed the field at dawn. He understood the stakes, the risks, the slender margin upon which his army's survival rested. But he also understood the strengths the ground offered him. By forcing the French to advance through mud, by narrowing their vast host into a confined space, he could blunt their advantage and turn desperation into opportunity. The king's calm presence spread confidence. His men saw him armored and ready, and in him they drew strength. Across the field, the French nobles prepared with a very different spirit. Their banners fluttered brightly. Their armor gleamed in the morning light. Confidence ran high, for they believed the day was theirs by right. Yet their very pride would soon be tested by the land beneath their feet. The narrow corridor would not allow them to bring all their strength to bear at once. Instead, their vast army would advance in waves, compressed and slowed, each wave trampling into the mud left by the one before. The geography of Agincourt was more than scenery. It was destiny. The narrow field, the rain-soaked ground, the enclosing woods, all conspired to shape the clash to come. It was a battlefield that punished arrogance and rewarded discipline. The English, weary and hungry, held their line in silence, their long bows ready to unleash devastation. The French, resplendent and confident, arrayed themselves for glory. Both sides believed history waited on the other side of dawn. As the sun rose higher, the mist began to lift. The contours of the land grew sharper. The muddy furrows, the tree lines, the slight rise of ground where Henry had positioned his men. On that narrow stage, the fate of kings and nations would soon be decided. Agincourt was not just a place on a map. It was a crucible where numbers, pride, and tradition would be tested against discipline, endurance, and resolve. The armies stood facing one another, divided by little more than a stretch of mud. The silence of the morning hung heavy, broken only by the calls of birds and the distant clatter of armor. Both hosts waited for the signal to begin. The field was ready. The men were ready, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. The field was set, the armies drawn. On one side, the French stood radiant in armor and numbers, convinced that victory was theirs by right. On the other, the English waited in silence, their king at their center, their bows ready, their fate hanging on discipline and resolve. For a time, neither host moved, the morning air heavy with suspense. Then, at last, the stillness gave way. Henry V seized the moment, ordering his archers forward. Wooden stakes planted, bows raised. The first storm of arrows was about to fall, and with it, the Battle of Agincourt would begin. The morning silence at Agincourt was heavy with expectation. For hours, the two armies stared at one another across the muddy field, neither willing to move first. The French, confident in their numbers, waited for the English to act, believing that their sheer size would eventually force Henry's hand. The English, disciplined and patient, held their ground, knowing that every minute the enemy delayed was a minute of advantage in their favor. At last, Henry V gave the order. The English line advanced a short distance, just enough to bring the enemy within range of their most feared weapon, the longbow. Wooden stakes were driven firmly into the ground, angled outward to guard against cavalry. Behind this barrier, thousands of archers planted their feet in the mud, drew back the strings of their bows, and loosed. The sky darkened with the first storm of arrows. A sound like rushing wind swept across the field as shafts arced high, then fell upon the waiting French. Armor rang with the impact, horses reared in panic, and the French line was thrown into confusion. The arrows did not need to pierce every breastplate to have effect. They disrupted order, frightened mounts, and sowed doubt before the battle had truly begun. Volley after volley followed, relentless, rhythmic, raining down upon the massed host. The archers worked with practiced speed, drawing, loosing, drawing again, their movements honed by years of training. Each arrow carried not only wood and iron, but also the weight of English survival. The longbow was no ordinary weapon. It was the instrument that had humbled France before, and now, once more, it began to shape the field. For the French nobles, the provocation could not be ignored. To stand under the hail of arrows without striking back was intolerable to their pride. Their strategy of patience began to fray as frustration grew. Horses stamped and knights shifted restlessly, eager to silence the archers. What had begun as a confident wait turned into agitation. The rain of arrows was not simply a physical assault, but a psychological one, forcing the French to act sooner than they wished. Henry's gamble had worked. By striking first with his longbowmen, he compelled the French to abandon their advantage of time and composure. The opening act of Agincourt was not a clash of swords, but a storm from the sky, a curtain of arrows that set the rhythm of the battle. On that muddy field, the balance of numbers began to tilt, not through sheer strength, but through the discipline of bowmen who turned wood and string into destiny. The first phase was over. The field was disturbed, the French unsettled, the initiative seized. The storm of arrows had called them forward, and soon the weight of their response would thunder toward the English line. The storm of arrows had done its work. The French, unable to endure the relentless volleys, prepared to answer. Trumpets sounded across their lines, and with a shout, the first wave of mounted knights spurred their horses forward. The sight was magnificent. Armored riders, banners unfurled, the thunder of hooves beginning to shake the earth. To the French, this was the moment to restore their honor, to sweep aside the archers who mocked them with every shaft. But the field of Agincourt was no open plain. As the horses surged into the churned soil, their momentum faltered. The ground, soaked by autumn rains, clung to hooves and dragged them down. Mud splashed, fetlocks sank, and the charge that began with thunder quickly lost its force. Horses strained against the mire, knights pressed forward with determination, but every step became heavier, slower. From the English line, the archers seized their chance. Once more, volleys darkened the sky. Arrows rained upon the advancing cavalry, striking armor, saddles, and horses already struggling for footing. The sharpened stakes planted before the archers formed an unyielding barrier. Riders who managed to push through found their mounts balking, rearing, or falling short against the forest of wood and iron. The grand spectacle of chivalry was breaking against a wall of mud and discipline. Still, the French knights pressed on. Pride and courage drove them forward, even as the field conspired against them. Their formation, compressed by the narrow corridor of trees, became crowded and disordered. Those behind pushed against those before, but the mud and the rain of arrows held them back. What was meant to be a swift, crushing charge slowed into a desperate struggle for progress. The English archers, relentless, continued their rhythm, draw, loose, draw again, until the very air seemed filled with shafts. The knights who had hoped to scatter them instead found themselves trapped under a storm that would not cease. The weight of armor, once their greatest strength, now became a burden as the mire dragged at every limb, and the sky itself seemed to fall upon them. Henry's strategy was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. The charge had been provoked, the ground had done its part, and the longbows had turned glory into chaos. The first wave of French cavalry, so splendid at its beginning, was faltering before the English line. What should have been the proud opening blow of France had become a slow, grinding advance, weakened and disordered before it even reached its enemy. The clash of Agincourt had begun in earnest. The French knights had thrown themselves forward, but the field had betrayed them. Ahead, the English ranks stood firm, ready to meet what remained of the charge. The day's destiny was beginning to take shape. The collapse of the first French cavalry charge left the field scarred and muddied, but the battle was far from over. Behind the faltering horsemen, ranks upon ranks of French men-at-arms began to move forward. Clad in heavy armor, carrying lances and swords, they marched with determination, their pride undimmed by the struggles of their comrades. The honor of France, they believed, now rested on their shoulders. Yet the terrain showed no mercy. The narrow field, bordered by thick woods, compressed their vast numbers into a funnel. Thousands were forced into a confined space, shoulder to shoulder, with no room to maneuver. The ground, already torn by hooves and soaked by rain, was now churned further into clinging mud. Every step forward drained their strength, their armor weighing heavier with each pace. From across the field, the English archers prepared another storm. Once more, arrows darkened the sky, falling thick upon the advancing French. Helmets rang with the impacts, shields shuddered, men stumbled. The volleys did not break the French entirely, but they slowed the advance, turning order into disorder. Those struck down created obstacles for those behind, and the press of men forced them onward, deeper into the mire. At last, the vanguard reached the English line. The clash was fierce, but the English had chosen their ground well. Henry's men-at-arms stood firm, dismounted and ready, their ranks tight, their discipline unyielding. The French, packed tightly together, could not swing their weapons freely. Pressed from behind by their own numbers, they found themselves trapped in a mass that could neither retreat nor advance effectively. Here, the English countered. Archers, having loosed their arrows, threw down bows and seized axes, swords, and mallets. They rushed to the flanks and rear of the melee, striking at the disordered mass of French men-at-arms. The lightly armored bowmen moved more swiftly on the sodden ground, exploiting gaps, while Henry's dismounted knights held the line at the center. The French had come forward with overwhelming strength, but their power was neutralized by the very conditions of the field. The fight became one of endurance. The French pushed, heaved, and strained, but the weight of their armor and the press of bodies wore them down. The English, though fewer, fought with the advantage of space and cohesion. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The French assault, grand in its conception, was faltering in execution. What had begun as a confident advance of thousands was dissolving into chaos. The narrow field that should have carried them to victory had become their prison. Arrows from above or mud below, and English steel before them, all combined to grind their momentum to a halt. Henry's army, hungry and weary though it was, now held the upper hand. The second great assault of France had failed to break them, and as the morning wore on, it became clear that the weight of numbers could not easily overcome discipline, preparation, and the will to endure. The weight of the French assault pressed heavily upon the English line, but it was not enough to break it. Instead, the very mass of their army became their undoing. Trapped in the narrow corridor of Agincourt, thousands of knights and men-at-arms crowded together, their armor weighing them down, their horses struggling in the mud. What had begun as an advance of pride was devolving into confusion. The press of bodies grew unbearable. Those in the rear pushed forward, desperate to join the fight, but their momentum only crushed the ranks ahead. Men stumbled, fell, and were trampled under the sheer weight of their comrades. Horses, hemmed in by the trees and unable to maneuver, reared and balked, throwing the formations into greater disorder. The proud army of France, vast in number and brilliant in display, was being strangled by its own size. For Henry V, the moment had come. The English king, who had walked among his soldiers the night before, now took his place in the line of battle. Clad in armor, bearing his own sword, he fought side by side with his men. Chroniclers would later marvel that he was no distant commander, but a king in the thick of the struggle, striking and shouting encouragement, his presence steadying the line at its most perilous moment. For the weary English, the sight of their monarch sharing their peril filled them with renewed resolve. The longbowmen, having exhausted their arrows, joined the melee with hatchets, knives, and mallets. Swift and nimble compared to their armored foes, they harried the edges of the French mass, exploiting its disorder. Meanwhile, the English men-at-arms held firm in the center, bracing against the weight of enemy steel. Every yard of ground was contested, yet the French could not break through. Slowly, the tide turned. The French formations, crushed by numbers and sucked into the mire, lost cohesion. Knights who had once ridden proudly into battle found themselves unable to wield their weapons effectively, hemmed in by comrades on every side. The English, though fewer, maintained order, striking where they could, driving wedges into the crowded mass before them. The longer the fight dragged on, the clearer it became that endurance and discipline were prevailing over splendor and might. Then came the decisive collapse. The French vanguard, pressed to exhaustion, gave way under its own disorder. Those behind could neither retreat nor advance, and panic began to ripple through the host. The narrow field that had trapped them now became a snare from which there was no escape. By mid-morning, the outcome was sealed. The French, for all their numbers, were undone by their pride, the mud beneath their feet, and the relentless cohesion of their enemy. At Agincourt, Henry V had turned weakness into strength, desperation into triumph. His presence in the fray symbolized the unity of king and army, and as the French ranks broke, the legend of Agincourt was born. The breaking of the vanguard was the turning point. What had begun as a proud assault of knights and nobles had dissolved into panic, and the tide of battle shifted irreversibly. The French, trapped by their own numbers and the mire beneath their feet, could no longer recover order. The English, weary but unyielding, pressed forward with renewed determination. By mid-morning, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The struggle that had raged with such fury was giving way to collapse, and the field of Agincourt was about to bear witness to an extraordinary reversal of fortune. By mid-morning on October 25th, the field of Agincourt had become the crucible of France's undoing. The French assaults, vast and relentless, had been met and broken by a smaller, hungrier army that refused to yield. The thunder of hooves had been stifled by mud, the press of armored men had crushed itself, and now the field bore the weight of confusion and collapse. The French vanguard, exhausted and compressed into chaos, no longer possessed the strength to break through. Their knights, trapped shoulder to shoulder, found themselves unable to wield their weapons with effect. Behind them, fresh contingents tried to press forward, but the funnel of the field prevented their deployment. Instead of reinforcing, they only deepened the congestion. Thousands of men were packed into too narrow a space, drained by fatigue, battered by arrows, and stalled against an English line that would not bend. Henry's army, though weakened by hunger and illness, held fast. The longbowmen, their arrows mostly spent, now fought as foot soldiers with whatever weapons they could wield. Their mobility and numbers around the flanks turned the melee into a slow but steady advance of English resolve. The men-at-arms clustered around their king remained the anchor of the line, refusing to yield even as wave after wave pressed against them. By late morning, the signs of collapse were unmistakable. The French formations that had once glittered with banners and armor were dissolving into disorder. Men who had come seeking glory now sought only to survive. The narrow field that had promised a grand confrontation instead ensured entrapment. Those who stumbled could not rise again. Those who tried to retreat were blocked by their own comrades. The momentum that had once seemed unstoppable had turned into paralysis. Henry V himself stood firm in the heart of the fray. Chroniclers later described how he struck down opponents, encouraged his men, and embodied the very spirit of endurance. His presence made clear that this was not merely a battle of soldiers, but a trial for a kingdom's future. In his resolve, the English found their own. At last, the French line buckled. Their assaults, so bold in conception, had shattered against discipline, terrain, and sheer determination. Panic spread as realization dawned. Numbers had not saved them, nor had their pride. The knights who had entered the field confident of victory now found themselves trapped in futility. Slowly the tide receded, and the once mighty host of France gave way to defeat. The English, astonished at their own survival, pressed the advantage. They did not pursue recklessly, but tightened their grip, driving the disordered enemy back, step by step. What had begun as desperation was ending as triumph. When the fighting finally subsided, Henry's small army stood victorious upon the field, surrounded by the remnants of a far greater foe. The scale of the victory soon became clear. Against overwhelming odds, the English had not only held but broken an army several times their size. The field of Agincourt, soaked with rain and trampled by thousands, had witnessed a reversal so unlikely that it seemed almost providential. For Henry, it was vindication of his claim, his leadership, and his faith in the men who followed him. As the day waned, silence fell across the field, where hours earlier the noise of battle had roared. The English, exhausted but exalted, knew they had achieved something extraordinary. They were not merely survivors of a hopeless march, they were victors of one of the greatest battles of the age. And as the sun set over Agincourt, the legend was already taking shape, that on this narrow, muddy field, a king and his outnumbered host had defied the impossible and won. As the echoes of combat faded and the field fell into uneasy silence, the true weight of Agincourt began to emerge. Victory was certain, but beneath the banners of triumph lay the stark reality of loss. The clash had not only determined the fate of the day, it had reshaped the very fabric of nations. Now, with the fighting ended, attention turned from the fury of the charge to the reckoning of its cost. When the clamor of battle at Agincourt faded, the true scale of the day's events came into view. What had begun as a contest of armies ended as a reckoning for the nobility of France. The losses among the French were staggering, not only in numbers but in the rank and name of those who had fallen. It was not simply an army that had been broken, but the very leadership of a kingdom. On the field lay the wreckage of French chivalry. Thousands of knights and men-at-arms had perished or been taken prisoner. Among them were some of the greatest names of the realm, dukes, counts, and barons whose lineages stretched back for centuries. The Duke of Alençon, brother of the king's consort, was slain. The Duke of Bar and the Duke of Brabant fell in the fighting. High-ranking counts of Nevers, Marle, and many more were lost. Rarely had so many of France's nobility been struck down in a single day. For the French crown, the blow was not only military but social and political. Entire families had been decapitated of heirs, and the fabric of the aristocracy was torn. The losses extended beyond the nobility. Thousands of common soldiers drawn from towns and villages had joined the muster and did not return. For France, the grief was widespread, touching castles and cottages alike. Chroniclers wrote of widows and orphans multiplied across the land, of noble houses thrown into succession crises, of vassals left leaderless. The kingdom had suffered not just a defeat, but a generational wound. For the English, the contrast was remarkable. Against an enemy that outnumbered them several times over, their losses were astonishingly light. Estimates vary, but most accounts speak of only a few hundred English casualties. Among the fallen was the Duke of York, a cousin of the king, whose death was mourned deeply. Yet beyond this, the English army emerged largely intact. Where France had lost thousands, England had lost hundreds. Where France had seen its nobility shattered, England's leaders stood firm beside their king. The disparity was so great that it became part of the legend. Chroniclers and poets marveled at how such a small force could triumph at such small cost against such vast opposition. To many, it seemed not only a victory of arms, but of providence. The survival of the English host, weary and diminished before the battle, appeared nothing short of miraculous. Henry V himself recognized the scale of what had been achieved. He ordered thanks to be given, not only for victory, but for mercy in the losses his men had endured. The fallen were honored, their sacrifice remembered, but the small number compared to the enemy was a source of wonder as much as of grief. For the English, Agincourt would be remembered not only as a triumph of courage, but as a day when fortune and faith seemed to shield them. In France, the mourning was profound. The death of so many nobles weakened the monarchy at a moment when unity was already fragile. Rival factions would seize upon the vacuum, deepening divisions that had long plagued the realm. The absence of heirs left disputes that would simmer for decades. Agincourt was not merely a defeat, It was a disaster that unbalanced the very order of French society. Thus, the human cost of Agincourt was measured not only in the thousands who fell, but in the ripple of consequences their absence created. For France, it was the loss of a generation of leaders. For England, it was a victory won at a price that seemed improbably light. On that narrow, muddy field, the fate of kingdoms had been reshaped not only by who lived and who died, but by the disproportion that lay between the two. The reckoning of lives lost at Agincourt revealed more than sorrow. It revealed opportunity. France, robbed of its leaders and heirs, staggered under the weight of grief and disarray. England, by contrast, emerged with its nobility intact and its king exalted by triumph. From this imbalance of loss grew the seeds of political transformation. What followed was not only the mourning of one nation, but the exaltation of another, as Agincourt's outcome began to shape crowns, councils, and the destiny of kingdoms. The triumph at Agincourt did not end with the clash of arms. Its echoes carried across kingdoms, shaping politics and altering the balance of power in Europe. For England, the victory transformed a fragile monarchy into one girded by glory. For France, the defeat deepened internal divisions and left its crown vulnerable. The battle was not only a turning point on the field, but a pivot in the dynastic struggle that defined the 100 Years' War. In England, Henry V emerged from Agincourt not merely as a victorious commander, but as a hero of mythic stature. He had taken a weakened, half-starved army into the very heart of France and returned triumphant against impossible odds. News of the victory electrified the realm. Chroniclers compared it to the triumphs of antiquity. Priests declared it a sign of divine favor. For a kingdom weary of civil discord under his father, Henry's victory was proof of unity restored. He was no longer simply the son of Henry IV, whose reign had been clouded by rebellion and suspicion, but a king whose right to rule was sanctified by providence and sealed in bloodless glory. The political impact at home was immediate. Henry's authority was unchallenged. Nobles who might once have harbored ambitions of independence or intrigue now rallied behind a monarch who had led them to an immortal victory. The Parliament, often fractious in its dealings with kings, showered him with praise and support. Taxes for the continuation of war were granted with little resistance, for the people believed in the righteousness of his cause. Henry V had become the embodiment of English kingship, a warrior, a statesman, and a symbol of divine sanction. Abroad, the shockwaves were no less profound. France reeled not only from the staggering losses of its nobility, but from the crisis of legitimacy that followed. King Charles VI, plagued by bouts of mental illness, could not project strength. The realm was split between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, each suspicious of the other, neither able to claim full control. Into this vacuum of authority stepped Henry V, his reputation soaring, his leverage magnified by victory. Over the next 5 years, Henry pressed his advantage. Campaigns in Normandy consolidated his gains. Castles fell, towns submitted, and French lords, weakened by factional strife, sought accommodation rather than resistance. The image of Agincourt hung over every negotiation, the reminder that even vast numbers could not guarantee salvation against English discipline and resolve. The culmination of this ascendancy came in 1420 with the Treaty of Troyes. Negotiated after years of war and political maneuvering, it represented the zenith of Henry's power. By its terms, King Charles VI of France recognized Henry V not merely as a victorious adversary, but as his heir. The treaty disinherited the Dauphin, the king's own son, and promised that Henry, upon Charles' death, would inherit both the crown of England and the crown of France. To contemporaries, it was nothing short of astonishing. A king who had crossed the Channel with a small, desperate army had positioned himself to rule 2 kingdoms. The Treaty of Troyes elevated Henry to a place no English monarch had ever stood before. His claim was now enshrined not only in conquest, but in law. The victory at Agincourt had opened the door, and the treaty closed it behind him with legitimacy. In England, the moment was celebrated as the final vindication of all the sacrifices made in the war. In France, it was a humiliation, a reminder of weakness, and a bitter legacy that would fuel resistance in the years ahead. Yet in the autumn of 1415, none of this was yet certain. What was clear, however, was that Henry had crossed a threshold. He had turned a desperate march into a victory that reshaped the political map of Europe. He had forged unity at home, paralyzed his enemies abroad, and set the stage for a claim to crowns beyond his own. Agincourt was more than a battle. It was the foundation upon which Henry built the vision of a dual monarchy, and for a fleeting moment it seemed that vision might endure. Yet Agincourt's legacy was not confined to thrones and treaties alone. Beyond the halls of power and the ink of diplomacy, the battle reshaped the very language of war. What unfolded on that muddy field in Picardy was not merely a triumph of a king's ambition, but a revelation in military practice. The clash between armored chivalry and the disciplined rain of arrows carried lessons that echoed across Europe, altering the balance not only of crowns, but of tactics, strategy, and the future of armies. Agincourt was not only a political triumph, it was a revolution in the art of war. On that narrow, rain-soaked field, the supremacy of the longbow was written into the history of Europe. For centuries, the armored knight on horseback had been the symbol of military power, the embodiment of feudal strength. Yet at Agincourt, that symbol crumbled before disciplined bowmen drawn from the fields and villages of England. The battle demonstrated, more clearly than ever before, that technology, training, and terrain could overcome tradition and rank. The English longbow was no mere weapon, it was a system of war. Each archer carried a weapon as tall as a man, capable of delivering arrows with lethal force at extraordinary range. A skilled longbowman could loose 10 or more shafts a minute, a storm of missiles that no charge could withstand unscathed. At Agincourt, thousands of such bowmen, hardened by practice and supported by simple defenses of wooden stakes, transformed the battlefield into a trap. The French cavalry, once considered unstoppable, found themselves broken not by equal numbers of knights, but by common men wielding bows of yew. The psychological impact was as important as the physical for the nobility of France and much of Europe. Agincourt shattered the mystique of the mounted knight. Chivalric ideals had long placed the armored warrior at the pinnacle of battle, the decisive figure upon whom outcomes depended. But here, on a muddy field in Picardy, it was the yeomen of England, the archers of the shires, who carried the day. In their hands lay the future of warfare, not the single heroic charge, but the disciplined coordination of infantry and missile power. This lesson reverberated across Europe. Military thinkers and commanders could no longer ignore the implications. The rise of massed missile troops, supported by field fortifications, signaled a shift away from the dominance of cavalry. Agincourt was not the first time this truth had been revealed. Crécy and Poitiers had offered earlier warnings, but it was Agincourt that etched it indelibly into memory. 3 great French defeats across 3 generations, all at the hands of English archers, left no doubt the knight was no longer supreme. The consequences extended beyond tactics. Feudal armies built around the prestige of mounted nobles proved vulnerable to disciplined common soldiers. The battlefield was becoming more democratic, its outcomes shaped not only by lineage and armor, but by training, organization, and the intelligent use of terrain. The longbow gave voice to this change, elevating the role of the commoner in war and foreshadowing the rise of professional armies that would define the later Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance. For England, the lesson was one of vindication. The longbow had been the cornerstone of their military strategy for nearly a century, and at Agincourt it had proved its worth beyond dispute. The yeomen who carried the weapon were not merely auxiliaries, but the decisive arm of the army. Their endurance, their discipline, and their devastating firepower reshaped the identity of English warfare. Future generations would look back on the longbow as the weapon that carried England's fortunes across the Channel. For France and her allies, the reckoning was harder. The chivalric order upon which their military pride rested had been broken, not by dishonor, but by the simple fact that battlefield realities had changed. Some clung to tradition, unwilling to accept that the heroic charge of armored knights could be eclipsed. Yet others began to adapt, experimenting with combined arms field defenses, and in later decades, firearms that would replace even the longbow itself. Agincourt was thus both a climax and a transition, the last great victory of the longbow and the herald of a new era in war. In the centuries to come, historians would debate the meaning of the battle. Some saw it as the death knell of chivalry, others as the triumph of common discipline over aristocratic pride. Yet all agreed that Agincourt marked a turning point. The mud, the arrows, and the narrow field spoke a truth no one could ignore, that the age of the knight was waning, and the future of war belonged to those who could adapt. Yet Agincourt's legacy was not confined to the manuals of war or the calculations of generals. What happened on that muddy field did more than reshape armies. It reshaped memory. The story of how a small, exhausted host triumphed over overwhelming might was too vivid, too symbolic, to remain only a lesson in tactics. It passed beyond the realm of strategy into the realm of myth, carried by chroniclers, poets, and eventually playwrights, until the battle lived as much in imagination as in history. Agincourt's significance did not end with politics or military theory. Its legacy lived on in the imagination of a people, becoming more than a battle. It became a legend. For England, the victory was woven into the fabric of national identity, retold in chronicles, sung in ballads, and eventually immortalized in drama. It was remembered not only as a triumph of arms, but as a symbol of justice, courage, and the improbable triumph of the few over the many. In the years immediately following the battle, English chroniclers lavished praise upon Henry V and his army. The tale of the small host who had crossed the Channel, endured hunger and sickness, and faced overwhelming odds only to emerge victorious was too powerful to ignore. Monks recorded it as a sign of divine favor. Court poets shaped it into verse, emphasizing the righteousness of England's cause. To the people of England, Agincourt was proof that their nation, though smaller and less wealthy than France, could stand tall against the mightiest of foes when led by a just king and united in faith. This idea that weakness could be turned into strength, that God stood with the just against the proud, became central to the memory of the battle. Agincourt was not simply a victory, it was a parable. For the English, it affirmed that their destiny did not rest in numbers or riches, but in courage, discipline, and divine providence. The story would echo for generations, each retelling sharpening its symbolic edge. By the 16th century, the legend of Agincourt had been revived and transformed by one of England's greatest voices, William Shakespeare. In his play, Henry V, performed in the 1590s, the battle became not merely a historical event, but a stage for timeless themes. Shakespeare's Henry is a king of eloquence and resolve, inspiring his men with the famous speech on the eve of battle. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. Though written nearly 2 centuries after the fact, the play fixed Agincourt forever in the English imagination as the ultimate story of fellowship and defiance. Through Shakespeare, Agincourt transcended the chronicles to become part of cultural memory. The lines spoken on stage resonated with audiences of Elizabethan England, themselves engaged in struggles against larger continental foes. Later generations would invoke the same words in times of crisis, from the trenches of the First World War. World War to the oratory of modern statesmen, Agincourt had become not just history, but a source of inspiration, a reminder that resolve and unity could overcome the most daunting odds. Beyond literature, Agincourt took root as a national myth. It was celebrated in ballads, commemorated in sermons, and remembered in anniversaries. The image of Henry V, calm and steadfast amidst the storm, became an ideal of kingship. The yeoman archers, rising from humble origins to decide the fate of nations, became symbols of the common people's strength. Together, they formed a narrative in which England itself was cast as the underdog who triumphed against arrogance and power. This symbolism endured because it spoke to something profound in the national character. Agincourt was remembered less for its strategy than for its meaning. It told of a kingdom small in number but great in resolve. A kingdom that could endure suffering and emerge victorious. A kingdom chosen by Providence to defy the odds. In this sense, Agincourt became more than medieval history. It became part of the enduring mythology of England. Even today, the name of Agincourt carries weight. It conjures images of courage in adversity, of a king among his men, of the few prevailing against the many. It is remembered not merely as a battle of the 100 Years' War, but as a cultural touchstone. In poems, plays, and national memory, Agincourt remains a symbol of the justice of the underdog, the triumph of courage over pride, and the enduring belief that destiny favors those who stand together in their darkest hour. Yet legends, however powerful, often invite questions. The very greatness of Agincourt's story, the underdog triumphing against impossible odds, meant that later generations sought to measure it more closely. If the battle had become a myth of courage and providence, it also became a subject of scrutiny. Chroniclers, poets, and historians alike began to ask, how vast truly was the French host? How small the English? How heavy the losses? In the shadow of myth, the struggle for numbers began, and with it, centuries of debate. Even as Agincourt became a legend, its details were subject to debate. The clash of October 1415 was remembered not only for its drama, but also for the questions it left behind. How many fought? How many fell? What was the true scale of Henry V's achievement? For centuries, historians, chroniclers, and poets have wrestled with these questions, each shaping the battle in the image of their own perspective. The earliest accounts came from contemporaries. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart, though he had died before Agincourt, influenced the narrative with his vivid depictions of earlier battles like Crécy and Poitiers, emphasizing the overwhelming odds faced by the English. His successor, Enguerrand de Monstrelet, recorded Agincourt itself, offering numbers that painted the French host as vast, perhaps as many as 50,000. English sources, eager to magnify the miracle of victory, embraced such estimates, sometimes speaking of 60,000 or more. The contrast with Henry's 6,000 or 7,000 men was thus presented as nearly impossible, reinforcing the story of divine favor. Yet not all were convinced. Some French chroniclers, while acknowledging the disaster, suggested lower numbers. They argued that though France outnumbered England, the disparity was not as astronomical as the English claimed. Later historians, combing through muster rolls and records, proposed figures closer to 20,000 or 25,000 French, still several times greater than the English, but far from the legendary 60,000. The truth likely lies somewhere between exaggeration and understatement. Shaped by the needs of memory and propaganda, the debate over casualties was just as contentious. English sources described the French losses in the tens of thousands, whole swathes of nobility cut down in the mud. French sources admitted to heavy losses but cautioned against such inflated numbers. Modern scholarship suggests that between 6,000 and 10,000 French may have been killed or captured, with hundreds of nobles among them, a staggering blow to the aristocracy. The English, in contrast, reported only a few hundred dead. Here, too, the disparity was striking enough to seem miraculous, fueling the legend even if the figures were less dramatic than early accounts claimed. These debates reveal more than statistics. They reveal the power of perception. For the English, the greater the odds, the greater the glory. For the French, minimizing the numbers softened the humiliation. Each side shaped the narrative to fit its needs. Over time, the legend of the outnumbered few defeating the overwhelming many became the central motif, whether or not the ratio was truly as vast as claimed. Historians of later centuries continued to wrestle with the question. Some sought precision, analyzing records of lords and vassals, contracts of service, and payments to estimate troop strengths. Others argued that precision was impossible, and that the legend itself was the more important truth, that the perception of a small, beleaguered force triumphing against overwhelming odds was what gave Agincourt its enduring power. The argument over numbers also reflects the broader struggle between memory and fact in medieval history. Chronicles were not written as neutral records, but as moral lessons. To an English monk, Agincourt was proof of God's will. To a French chronicler, it was a tragedy tempered by pride. Numbers were less important than meaning. And yet, modern historians, with their methods of critical analysis, still return to the field, seeking to measure the immeasurable. What remains clear is that regardless of whether the French were 20,000 or 50,000, whether English losses numbered 200 or 500, the disparity in outcome was profound. A smaller English force, weakened by hunger and fatigue, stood against a far larger, French host, and emerged victorious. The scale of the victory may be debated, but its reality is beyond dispute. Thus, Agincourt lives on in two dimensions, as history and as legend. As history, it invites scrutiny, analysis, and debate over numbers and details. As legend, it requires no precision, for its truth lies in symbolism, the story of the few who defeated the many, of courage and discipline triumphing over arrogance and pride. Between these two, the battle endures, its scale forever contested, its meaning forever secure. Yet while scholars and chroniclers debated the numbers, the course of history itself moved forward. Agincourt could be remembered as miracle or myth, but its true weight lay in what followed. For England, the victory was not only a matter of pride, it became the launchpad for further conquest, the moment when Henry V seemed poised to unite two kingdoms under one crown. But as later events would reveal, what appeared to be a decisive turning point was also a fleeting high tide, a glory that would prove difficult to sustain. The Battle of Agincourt was, in many ways, the zenith of English fortunes in the 100 Years' War. It stood as a dazzling triumph, a moment when the crown of England seemed poised to extend its dominion across the Channel, and perhaps over all of France. Yet, as later events would prove, the battle was not the end of the conflict, but only a dramatic chapter within it. Its legacy was double-edged. While it enshrined Henry V as one of England's greatest kings, it also set expectations that his successors could not hope to fulfill. In the years immediately following Agincourt, Henry capitalized on his momentum. Campaigns in Normandy steadily expanded English control. By 1419, Rouen had fallen, and much of northern France was under English dominion. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 marked the apex of this ascendancy. Henry was recognized as heir to the French throne, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it appeared that the crowns of England and France might be joined in a single ruler, fulfilling dreams that had driven the Plantagenet kings for generations. Yet this triumph was fragile. In 1422, Henry V died suddenly at the age of 35, leaving his infant son Henry VI as king of both realms. The vision of a dual monarchy rested on the shoulders of a child and the regents who ruled in his name. Without Henry's leadership, the English position quickly weakened. The unity he had inspired dissolved into factionalism, while France, long divided by civil war, began to find new strength under determined leaders. The figure who embodied this resurgence was Joan of Arc. In 1429, she inspired the French to lift the siege of Orléans, a turning point that restored confidence and legitimacy to the Dauphin, now Charles VII. Her presence galvanized a nation weary of defeat and humiliation, and under her influence, French arms began to reverse the tide. What Agincourt had taken from France in morale, Joan restored, transforming despair into resistance. From that moment onward, the English position deteriorated. Despite holding important territories, they faced an enemy increasingly united and motivated. The French adapted their tactics, relying less on the heavy cavalry that had failed at Agincourt and more on artillery, fortifications, and professional armies. The longbow, once decisive, proved less effective against evolving strategies and stronger defenses. The technological and social transformations of the 15th century were tilting the balance away from England's traditional advantages. By mid-century, the tide had turned decisively. French forces, reorganized under Charles VII and his capable commanders, retook Normandy and Guyenne. The final blow came in 1453 at the Battle of Castillon, where French artillery shattered the last major English field army on French soil. With that, the 100 Years' War effectively ended. England retained only Calais, a small outpost on the northern coast, while the rest of its once vast continental empire was lost. Thus, Agincourt, though glorious, was revealed in hindsight as a high water mark rather than a permanent triumph. It showed the brilliance of Henry V's leadership, but also underscored the vulnerability of a kingdom that depended too heavily on the genius of a single monarch. Once he was gone, England lacked the cohesion and strength to maintain its conquests. The dream of a dual monarchy crumbled, replaced by the stark reality of defeat and retreat. For historians, this long arc raises questions about the true meaning of Agincourt. Was it a decisive victory, or was it a glittering illusion, masking the structural weaknesses of English power? Some argue that the battle gave England a false sense of security, convincing them that Providence would always favor the longbow and the few over the many. Others see it as an extraordinary achievement that nevertheless could not withstand the broader currents of change: the rise of centralized French monarchy, the evolution of military technology, and the limits of England's resources. What cannot be denied is the irony of Agincourt's legacy. It was a triumph so complete that it seemed to promise the conquest of France. Yet within a generation, those promises lay in ruins. The field that symbolized the pinnacle of English might also foreshadowed its decline, for it created expectations that the fragile kingdom could not sustain. Agincourt, in this sense, was both the glory and the tragedy of England in the 100 Years' War, the moment of greatest brilliance and the beginning of the long descent toward loss. Thus, in the grand arc of the 100 Years' War, Agincourt stood both as brilliance and as prelude to decline. Its immediate glory faded with the loss of France, yet its memory refused to vanish. If history judged it as a fleeting triumph, legend transformed it into something greater, for beyond treaties, crowns, and shifting borders, the battle endured in the imagination of England as a story of courage, unity, and the triumph of the few over the many. It is here, in memory rather than in conquest, that Agincourt found its true and lasting legacy. The story of Agincourt does not end with numbers, treaties, or the shifting fortunes of the 100 Years' War. Its true legacy lies in the meaning that people attach to it, both in the years that followed and across the centuries. Few battles in medieval history have carried such symbolic weight. Agincourt was never only about victory on a muddy field. It was about resilience in the face of despair, the power of leadership, and the way the fate of nations can hinge upon choices made in a single morning. For those who lived through it, the battle became proof that endurance and discipline could overcome overwhelming odds. An army weakened by hunger and sickness had stood firm against a host many times its size and emerged victorious. To later observers, it became a case study in how careful preparation, clever use of terrain, and tactical ingenuity could defeat brute force. Henry V's decision to anchor his men in a narrow corridor, defend them with sharpened stakes, and unleash the longbow's relentless volleys turned weakness into strength. He recognized the field not as an obstacle, but as an ally, one that would bog down and trap the French. More than this, he understood morale. His presence among his men, his words of encouragement, his willingness to share their danger, transformed an exhausted army into an unbreakable line. Agincourt was not merely a military encounter, it was a lesson in the art of command. The outcome made clear that war is not decided by numbers alone. The French, by most accounts, outnumbered the English by at least 2-1, perhaps more. Yet their advantage in manpower collapsed under the weight of poor coordination, muddy terrain, and overconfidence. The English, fewer but united in spirit, proved that leadership and strategy could offset numerical inferiority. The symbolism of the few defeating the many became the essence of Agincourt's memory. But the lesson of Agincourt is not one of triumph alone. It is also one of caution. For all its brilliance, the battle did not end the war. England's triumph, dazzling as it was, proved fleeting. Within a generation, the tide turned, and France regained its strength. The victory of a single day could not erase the broader currents of history: the rise of a centralized French monarchy, the evolution of new weapons and tactics, the limits of England's resources. Agincourt illustrates the paradox of history, where even the greatest victories may fade if not sustained by enduring power. Yet for England, Agincourt became more than a military event. It became a cornerstone of identity. From the 15th century onward, it was celebrated in chronicles, retold in songs, and invoked in sermons. It served as a reminder that England, though smaller than its continental rivals, could stand tall when united and guided by just leadership. The memory of the victory was carried across generations, becoming part of the national story. Its most enduring form came with Shakespeare, who transformed history into legend. In the late 16th century, his play Henry V gave Agincourt a voice that still resonates. The king's speech before battle, "We few, we happy few, "We band of brothers" etched itself into cultural memory. It presented Agincourt not only as a clash of armies, but as a parable of fellowship, courage, and unity. Though Shakespeare wrote nearly 2 centuries after the event, his dramatization fixed the meaning of the battle in the imagination of England and beyond. Through Shakespeare, Agincourt transcended chronicles and became myth. His words rang true not only for Elizabethan audiences, but for later generations. Soldiers in the trenches of the First World War repeated them as a source of courage. Statesmen quoted them in times of crisis. Filmmakers brought them to life for new audiences. Agincourt became shorthand for courage in adversity, for the triumph of the underdog, for the belief that unity can defy overwhelming odds. The enduring myth lies not in the tactical details, but in the moral force of the story. Agincourt speaks of a kingdom small in number, but great in resolve, of ordinary men rising to extraordinary deeds, of a king who stood with his soldiers. It is remembered as proof that destiny can favor the resolute, that unity can overcome division, and that the human spirit can shape history. In this way, Agincourt belongs not only to England, but to a broader tradition of legendary battles, like Marathon or Thermopylae, where the few defied the many and left an indelible mark on memory. Today, 6 centuries later, the name of Agincourt still carries power. It conjures images of a muddy field in northern France, of arrows falling from the sky, of weary men holding firm, and of a king standing among them. It is remembered not only as part of the 100 Years' War, but as a cultural touchstone. It is history, yes, but it is also story, symbol, and inspiration. And so the legacy of Agincourt is layered. As a battle, it was a tactical masterpiece, a stunning reversal of fortune. As history, it was a fleeting high point in a long war that ended in English defeat. But as memory, it endures. It is a reminder that courage, strategy, and leadership matter, that even in adversity, triumph is possible, and that the stories of the past shape the identity of nations. Though the 100 Years' War ended with England's retreat and loss of nearly all its French lands, the glory of Agincourt remained untarnished. On that narrow, rain-soaked field, Henry V and his men created more than a victory. They created a legend. It is the story of the underdog who defied the odds, the band of brothers who endured, and the moment when a king and his kingdom stood as one. That is why Agincourt, centuries later, is remembered not merely as a medieval battle, but as a beacon, a symbol of what can be achieved when unity, discipline, and courage come together on the stage of history.